Every time I went on the internet and typed in best fantasy books, it seemed like Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogy, consisting of Mistborn, The Well of Ascension, and The Hero of Ages, would get mentioned amongst the best fantasy books that are out there. Here is why I wouldn't necessarily say that they're amongst my personal favorite fantasy books. It took me 8.5 months, but I finally got through this trilogy. The fact that it took me so long might be a clue as to how captivated I was by the books. But before I get into that, let me say that the Mistborn trilogy is a fantasy series that I really think people who are fans of science fiction could really get into. I've never really been able to get into sci-fi books in general because I find that in order to create an entirely new fictional science and the world that goes with it and the technology and the peoples and everything else, it requires a lot of technical explanation, which really eats into the story, the narrative, the characters, and the action of the book. And so I find I get a little bit bored in general with sci-fi books. Now, the Mistborn trilogy is definitely a fantasy series. However, a couple of things I think would appeal to sci-fi fans. First of all, the one thing I kept seeing when I was reading these lists of fantasy books is when people talked about the Mistborn trilogy, they would talk about how amazingly developed the whole magic system was. And they would talk about the development of magic in this book and just how detailed and interesting it was. And it's true, Brandon Sanderson has put a lot of thought and effort into fleshing out the magic within the Mistborn trilogy. But as a result, it gets into that technical sci-fi world where it requires a fair bit of explanation as to how everything works together in the magical realm. But beyond that too, the series starts out very small with a few characters and their little world, and over the course of these 3 books grows and grows and grows until it encompasses gods and the entire world and the universe, and just grows into this massive big thing that, again, every step of the way requires the explanations as to what's going on. And it really felt to me like it outgrew the setting that was encompassed by the narrative, and I guess you could say it really felt like it jumped the shark at a certain point when it started to get really huge, especially right towards the end where things just got ridiculous and crazy. But again, a sci-fi reader is going to be used to discussions of worlds and galaxies and all these big picture type of topics. So it might hold their interest a little bit more than it held mine as things kind of expanded and grew. Now, I'm not saying that I disliked the books. They at least kept me interested enough to read through all 3 books. And they did cover some interesting themes throughout the series. For instance, one of the characters was a specialist in religions, and part of his journey throughout, particularly the 3rd book, was a journey of losing his own faith and having to rediscover it again. And so he makes some interesting observations about religion in general. This character's name is Sazed, and in the 1st book he says, "If, upon examination, you find that the ministry's teachings do not suit you, then I would be pleased to offer you an alternative." "What alternative?" Sazed smiled. "That depends. The right belief is like a good cloak, I think. If it fits you well, it keeps you warm and safe. The wrong fit, however, can suffocate." Now, without getting into my own personal beliefs, I'll just say that in general I am pretty anti-religious. However, religion has and does hold a very important role in many people's lives, and I think the fact that the right belief is like a good cloak that keeps you warm and safe is maybe a good description of when religion is done right for people. On the flip side, we have CZ in the third book struggling with his faith. It says, he'd assumed, therefore, that he would never have to deal with these emotions. That's why he'd been so unprepared to be betrayed by the only thing he couldn't accept as being flawed. He couldn't believe. If he believed, it meant that God, or the universe, or whatever it was that watched over man, had failed. Better to believe that there was nothing at all. Then all of the world's inadequacies were simply mere chance, not caused by a God who had failed them. For me, personally, that really hits the nail on the head, but again, I don't want to dive into those kind of topics right now. There's a lot of exploration, too, of love and trust. The main character, early in her life, had a lot of bad experiences in those areas, and she's had to learn how to love and to trust people again. Vin, the main character, is talking about a sacrifice of a loved one she had to make. She says, I let him bleed. Oh, I don't want to spoil that. She says, I consigned him to death. How, Sazed asked, how could you do such a thing? Because I looked into his eyes, Vin said, and knew it was what he wanted me to do. You gave me that, Sazed. You taught me to love him enough to let him die. To love somebody enough to let them die is true love indeed. On the same topic, we go back to the character named Sazed again, and he's thinking to himself, better to trust and be betrayed, Kelsier seems to whisper. It had been one of the survivors' mottos, better to love and be hurt. I've struggled so much with that concept since my wife left me a couple months ago. Better to love and be hurt. It certainly doesn't feel that way for me right now, but I guess I have to trust that maybe that's true. Now here's something that really threw me off for a little while. One of the characters is named Spook, and I think for the entire first book, he doesn't really speak English. He speaks this very kind of heavily accented, jumbled up form of English that is mostly incomprehensible. However, at one point in the first book, he speaks a perfectly clear sentence that as soon as I read that, I thought, he's a traitor. He's been faking it this whole time. He actually knows how to speak perfectly good English, but this author has given us a clue that, wait a minute, there's something about him that we're not quite realizing. And so for much of the rest of the book, I was waiting for this big reveal to come up where it was like, yeah, he knew what was going on all along, but he was a spy or something like this. But I guess the editor must have missed the fact that this character Spook spoke a single, totally coherent sentence in the entire book, and the rest of the time spoke pretty much gobbledygook. So that threw me right for a loop, although it turned out to be nothing after all. So what did I like about the books? Well, Brandon Sanderson does create this truly unique world with this amazingly fleshed out magic system and all these races of people that have no real comparison in any other type of a book I read. So in that manner, again, it's very science fiction-like in that you are experiencing these very unique peoples and settings. There's a race called the Khandra that in particular I found really fascinating, that there were these sort of shape-shifting type creatures. And reading about them made me realize how cool it would be to see on a screen in movie format, to see them visualized just because of how unique and interesting they were. I really like that this lead character here is a strong female. I think that strong female leads are sadly lacking in, well, in fiction in general, but in fantasy fiction in particular. However, even then, 410 pages into the first book, there's a sentence here where the lead character Vin is talking, and it says, "Running?" the girl asked. "We're not taking a canal boat." It's like, it's not the girl. This is Vin, the powerful main character here. It was so jarring to see her referred to as the girl by the author at this point in the book. And similarly, there's another character who's disabled, who's actually a paraplegic. And again, that's a cool thing that you wouldn't normally see in fantasy fiction. However, again, perhaps the most pure and good character in the book, a character named Elend, at one point is having a conversation with another fellow named Ham. Ham smiled and said, "Set," the paraplegic character, "Set is going to be furious." Ellen shrugged. "He's a paraplegic. What's he going to do? Bite us? Come on." And I was like, come on. You had this great character and you're going to have one of your best, kindest, goodest characters say something like that. You're so close, so close. But, oh well. There was, I can say, some really interesting development with a couple of these characters. The character Spook, in particular, the way he developed from book 1 to book 3 was really cool. The complexity of that particular character, Set, as well, was very interesting in this sort of good side and evil side to him. So there were some really interesting characters, in addition to the interesting races and worlds that they inhabit. Overall, though, there's just something about the flow of the story that didn't hold my interest quite as much as I would have liked. It was interesting, but not really captivating, and the ending I just thought was just way too much for me. However, if you like really diving into a unique world with a story that expands and grows into something really huge, it's something that you might be interested in checking out. For me, I'm going to dive back into some nonfiction and read another true science book. Enough of this fake science and magic stuff, as fun as it is. Meanwhile, tell me what you've been reading. I'm always interested in hearing about good books, so please let me know in the comments below. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to thank my Patreon supporter Joanna for her support. Happy reading! Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you could consider doing one of the following things, I would appreciate it. Give me a thumb up, subscribe to my channel. If you've already subscribed, hit that notification bell, or share the link to the video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Checkity, checkity, check, check, check. Every time I went on the internet and typed in best fantasy books, it seems that Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogy popped up as being mentioned amongst the best fantasy books. The fact that it took me so long might be a clue as to how enraptured and how captivated. The series starts out as religion has then all of the world's inadequacies